Welcome, Wildcats and guests. My name is Rose Stremlau, and I'm faculty in the departments of History and Gender and Sexuality Studies here at Davidson College. We're live streaming from campus, where we miss seeing our students very much. Even though we are scattered in homes around the world, we're still a learning community, and I'm glad that you could join us for the fourth of 6 lectures in our social distancing lecture series. Each Wednesday from now until May 6th, a member of our faculty will moderate a conversation with a scholar who will share their research about human experiences of disease and recovery in the past in order to help us put our experiences of this pandemic in context. You can see the rest of the lineup at the calendar at the bottom of Davidson College's homepage. That's www.davidson.edu. Our speaker tonight will talk for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. At any point during the event, we welcome you to ask a question or to comment on the YouTube live chat. You will need to log in with a Google email address or your Davidson credentials to leave a comment. If you feel comfortable doing so, please let us know your name, where you're coming from, and if you are a community member or if you're a member of the Davidson College community. We like to know who is participating. Before we begin, I would like to thank the staff members who have made this possible. Ebony Stubbs, Amy Elkins, Daniel Linz, Adele Patton, Winnie Newton, and everyone at College Communications. Dr. Mikaela Adams is an associate now, correct? Yes, associate professor of Native American history at the University of Mississippi. She received her doctorate from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her first book, Who Belongs? Race, Resources, and Tribal Citizenship in the Native South, was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. And Who Belongs explores how 6 southeastern Indian nations, including Davidson's neighbors, the Catawba Indian Nation of South Carolina and the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians here in North Carolina, determined tribal citizenship and exercised tribal sovereignty in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Adams' current project, tentatively entitled Influenza in Indian Country, Indigenous Sickness, Suffering, and Survival During the 1918 to 1919 Pandemic, will provide an ethno-historical account of the world's deadliest pandemic and its long-term consequences for Native American communities across the United States by exploring how the virus infected Indigenous people, how they responded, and how this health crisis affected the federal-tribal relationship. Mikaela, you have the web.
Thank you so much, Rose. And I really want to thank Davidson College and especially you, Rose, for putting together this really innovative and exciting lecture series, especially on such short notice and in such trying times. It feels wonderful to still be part of this scholarly community, even under these strange circumstances. So thank you so much for inviting me to participate. My talk today is called Influenza in Indian Country, the Healthcare Costs of Economic, Cultural, and Racial Marginalization During the 1918 to 1920 Pandemic. So I'll just go right ahead and get started. In early October 1918, Albert Reagan, an Indian Service School administrator, arrived at the Western Navajo Agency to take charge of the Marsh Pass boarding school. It was an inopportune moment to begin his tenure, for within just a few weeks, practically every pupil at the Indian school was down with a devastating illness. Before long, the reservation had devolved into an apocalyptic landscape of the dead and dying. Whole families were wiped out, Reagan lamented, leaving their sheep wandering about over the hills to run wild at the mercy of the coyotes. By the time the outbreak ended the following spring, Reagan counted 148 deaths within a 25-mile radius of the school, and many more perished elsewhere on the reservation. The Spanish flu had taken a terrible toll in Navajo country. A deadly new strain of avian influenza that first emerged sometime in the early spring of 1918, the so-called Spanish flu, infected global populations with shocking intensity and devastating results. Like seasonal flus, the Spanish influenza was a respiratory disease that provoked fever, body aches, chills, fatigue, coughing, and chest pain in its victims. But Spanish influenza was unusually severe, resulted in death rates that were 5 to 20 times higher than normal. In addition, unlike seasonal flus that typically fell the very young and the very old, the Spanish flu killed people in the prime of life. It was often the body's extreme immune response to the virus that proved fatal. The Spanish flu traveled the globe in 4 deadly waves, the worst of which hit in the fall of 1918. By 1920, it had infected 1/3 of the global population and killed at least 50 million people worldwide, including more than 675,000 in the United States. As historian Alfred Crosby noted, nothing else, no infection, no war, no famine, has ever killed so many in as short a period. Indian country, the area within the United States inhabited by the nation's indigenous peoples, was particularly hard hit. According to a 1919 report, at least 78,000 Native people caught influenza and 6,600 died out of a population of just 320,000. This indigenous mortality rate of 2.1% was nearly 4 times higher than that of the nation's large cities. My current research project traces the history of the influenza pandemic in Indian country. For the purposes of my talk today, I will focus on the ways in which the economic, cultural and racial marginalization of Native American people in the early 20th century limited their access to medical care and contributed to their disproportionate mortality rate during the pandemic. I will also briefly outline some of the lessons we might draw from that experience when we consider the ongoing health needs of marginalized communities today, especially in the midst of the current COVID-19 crisis. Influenza was an imperial disease. It traveled along the pathways forged by industrializing nations as they endeavored to expand their political and economic influence across the globe. The First World War, the culmination of tensions between rival imperial powers, facilitated the virus's spread as soldiers and laborers moved into position and concentrated into unsanitary camps. Native Americans, meanwhile, were a colonized people. In the 40 years that preceded the pandemic, they had undergone tremendous changes that exposed them to new disease environments. The Western Indian Wars, which drew to a close in 1890, forced indigenous people into crowded reservations where they could no longer pursue their traditional subsistence practices. Federal allotment policy, implemented in 1887, then divided that reservation land into individual parcels and sold the so-called surplus land to non-Indians. Within just a few decades, Native people lost control of approximately 90 million acres of land, which reduced them to shocking poverty. By the early 20th century, disease ran rampant in Indian communities. A 1912 investigation conducted by the US Public Health Service, for example, revealed that, quote, the prevalence of tuberculosis among Indians was very greatly in excess of that among the white race. Out of 42,000 Indians surveyed, 16.11% tested positive for tuberculosis. And some communities experienced especially high infection rates. Among the Jicarilla Apaches of New Mexico, for example, 95.5% of the children over 11 years old had contracted tuberculosis. Economic marginalization meant that Indians already suffered from disproportionately poor health when Spanish influenza infiltrated their communities in 1918. And this made it all the more difficult for them to fight off infection. To their credit, the Indian Office and Congress recognized the effects that federal policies had had on Indian health. And in the decade immediately preceding the pandemic, they made some efforts to rectify the situation. Following the US Public Health Service investigation, for example, Congress increased its annual appropriation to relieve Indians in distress and prevent disease. In 1911, Congress appropriated just $40,000 for this purpose. But by 1914, the appropriation had quintupled to $200,000. Commissioner of Indian Affairs Cato Sells, who assumed office in 1913, made health a top priority, and he launched several sanitary campaigns on reservations. Although certainly an improvement over federal inaction in the past, these programs were habitually underfunded and could not make up for decades of neglect. The entry of the United States into the First World War, moreover, led to a nationwide shortage of medical professionals just in time for the outbreak of influenza. Although the Indian Office entered into an agreement with the US Public Health Service to hire additional physicians and nurses on reservations during the crisis, officials often found it difficult to find appropriate personnel to fill these positions. The rural isolation of most Native people in early 20th century America was one of the main factors that delayed or limited their access to medical care in 1918. Now, isolation might seem like a plus during a pandemic. And it's true that some tribal communities were spared the initial onslaught of influenza due to their distance from population centers. The Goshute people in Utah, for example, escaped the fall 1918 wave of the pandemic due to the fact that they lived in the open and moved their camps from time to time and did not touch very often with population centers. Influenza usually found a way in any way, however, whether along trade routes, railroad lines, or even through the movements of agency personnel. By early January 1919, 88 Goshutes had fallen sick and 9 had died. Once the virus was present, isolation became a liability since few doctors wanted to take jobs in the middle of nowhere, especially when there was plenty to do in influenza-stricken cities. The low pay offered to Indian service physicians only compounded this problem. As a professor of public health complained shortly after the pandemic, the average physician caring for Indians is paid less by the government than the average street cleaner. The Indian office was thus forced to hire people with dubious qualifications and characters, if indeed they could hire anyone at all. In late October 1918, for example, the superintendent of the Fort McDermott Indian School in Nevada begged the Indian office to allow him to hire a physician known to be an alcoholic. If he would stay sober, the superintendent pleaded, this doctor would be the best man we could ever expect to secure for this position. And the Indian office agreed. More often than not, in the absence of medical professionals, reservations had to rely on untrained employees and volunteers and Indian people themselves. Although many of these people did the best they could during the influenza outbreak, they did not have the training to provide superior care. Despite the fact that it was unable to supply Indian communities with sufficient medical help during the pandemic, the Indian office also refused to accept Native medicine men and women as allies. One of the primary goals of the early 20th century Indian office was the cultural assimilation of Native peoples. To achieve this goal, officials opened Indian boarding schools across the country to provide Indigenous children with rigid military-style English-only educations while separating them from their cultures and their communities. Officials also encouraged missionaries to come to reservations to spread Christianity and to free tribal peoples from their so-called superstitions. Since traditional Indigenous understandings of sickness and health were bound up with their spiritual beliefs, medicine men and women typically had a religious function as well as a healing one within Native societies. Treatment of the sick not only included herbal remedies, poultices, and steam baths, but also chants, songs, and prayers. Navajo healers, for example, held sings for the sick where they chanted in unison and importuned the spirits for intercession. According to oral tradition, the Ojibwe jingle dress dance came into existence during the pandemic after an Ojibwe father in central Minnesota received a vision about how to cure his influenza-stricken daughter. The girl recovered and the dance soon spread among other Indigenous families in the Great Lakes region. From the perspective of white officials, however, these kinds of healing rituals and dances were unacceptable. Native healers were nothing more than charlatans who were holding their people back from progress. As Cato Sells remarked to a congressional committee in 1919, I sometimes say that the passing of the medicine man is the barometer as to the progress of the Indians. This cultural chauvinism on the part of federal officials meant that they were unwilling to work with medicine men and women during the pandemic. Indeed, conflicts often broke out between agency employees, medical personnel, and these healers, which in turn affected the willingness of Native people to submit to allopathic treatment. Volunteer nurses in a Hopi village in Arizona, for example, insulted local medicine men and got the village mad so that the Indians refused to receive any attention from them or take any medicine administered by them. Similarly, so-called active and troublesome medicine men at the Ute Mountain Agency in Colorado discouraged fellow tribesmen from accepting treatment following several run-ins with the agency nurse. In such situations, Indigenous healers served as a convenient scapegoat for agency officials who were overwhelmed by reservation mortality statistics. Horrified by the 25% case fatality rate suffered by Indians under his jurisdiction, for example, the superintendent of the Cape Verde Agency in Arizona blamed the outcome on Yavapai Indians who, quote, thought that they knew how to manage the disease better than he did. Yet, had white officials been more tolerant of Indigenous beliefs and cultural practices, and if they'd worked with rather than against Native healers, they might have enjoyed more success in administering allopathic treatments in ways that were acceptable to Native people. Cultural chauvinism also limited the success of agency efforts to halt the spread of influenza. Since very few effective remedies existed in 1918 for viral infections, prevention was key, much like it is now in our current situation with COVID-19. installing quarantines, banning public gatherings, and limiting interpersonal contacts were some of the most effective medical tools available during the influenza outbreak. When agency officials endeavored to implement these social distancing protocols, however, they often did so with the ulterior motive of disrupting Indigenous cultural practices. In South Dakota, for example, the superintendent of the Rosebud Agency banned funeral feasts for Sioux soldiers killed in the First World War. Although this ban had the solid medical goal of preventing large public gatherings that could spread disease, the superintendent couldn't resist telling his Indigenous charges that such feasts were entirely out of harmony with modern progress and thus inappropriate for people who otherwise were standing so nobly by their government and sending their sons to war. He ordered his agency farmers to make sure that the Sioux respected this ban. Similarly, in mid-October 1918, the superintendent of the Cantonment Agency in Oklahoma complained that a ceremonial gathering of Arapahoes on the reservation was nothing more than a cover for gambling and other vices. Rather than explain the medical danger of this assembly, he framed their gathering as a defiant regression to savagery and threatened to call the sheriff if they did not break camp and go to their homes at once. A month later, the same superintendent disparaged a gift dance held by Cheyennes and visiting Ponca Indians. Once again, the superintendent resorted to force to break up the gathering. He asked the county sheriff to round up all visiting Indians and either send them home or, if they refused, to go put them in jail. Native people viewed efforts to ban gatherings and cancel dances as a continuation of blatant attacks on their cultural identities and religious practices, and thus were often unwilling to accept these as medically necessary during the pandemic. In early 1919, for example, Johnson Ironbull, a Sioux from the Pine Ridge Agency in South Dakota, wrote letters to white allies protesting that the government had unjustly stopped his people's dances. He asked to have these restrictions lifted. Similarly, Arapahoes and Cheyennes in Oklahoma were not inclined to cooperate with authorities, even under threat of arrest. Northern Paiute and Western Shoshone people in Nevada, meanwhile, were so used to assaults on their cultural practices that they remained unmoved even after their superintendent explained to them the danger of influenza. Instead of immediately disbanding from their assembled annual dance in mid-October, they insisted that they be allowed to continue to dance 2 more nights. Decades of cultural attacks made Native people wary of any effort to suppress their practices during the pandemic, which unfortunately increased their chances of exposure to influenza. Instead of fostering cross-cultural cooperation during the crisis, federal agents had created a hostile environment that bred misunderstanding and resistance. And as we've seen in recent weeks, it's hard enough to convince people to practice social distancing today. Imagine how much harder that would be if those orders were coming from a government that had spent the last half century doing everything in its power to stamp out the American way of life. Native suspicions of federal motivations become even more understandable when we consider the Indian Office's decisions regarding Indian boarding schools during the pandemic. Although local authorities across the country closed public schools during the worst of the outbreak to stem the spread of the virus, much like today, the Indian Office decided that Indigenous children had as good a chance to escape the disease in a boarding school as they had in their reservation homes, and thus refused to close these schools. Federal officials justified this decision on the grounds that boarding schools had better medical facilities than reservations, which they argued meant that children had a better chance for recovery at school than at home. Yet financial incentives lay at the heart of this decision, since Congress funded boarding schools on the basis of average annual attendance. The Indian Office knew that if it sent children home, it risked losing monetary support for its fundamental mission of assimilating Indigenous children. Native parents objected to the risk the Indian Office took by keeping their children in overcrowded schools during the outbreak. They knew that despite Indian Office assurances, many of these schools did not have the staff or the facilities to care for dozens, if not hundreds, of sick children if disaster struck. Cheyenne River Sioux parents, for example, wrote their superintendent to demand that he discontinue the educational work on account of the influenza. If their children were forced back into school following the Christmas holidays, the Sioux protested, it would cause the parents an extreme cold trip because we love our children as they are of our blood and we must see them during their illness, which will surely spread the influenza. In another tragic case, a desperate father from the Lower Brule Indian Reservation defied Indian Office directives and smuggled his daughter out of the Pierre Indian School in South Dakota after his other 2 children died there from influenza. Despite parental protests and acts of subversion, the boarding schools stayed open. In some cases, superintendents who were worried about school finances continued to enroll new students even after the disease struck their institutions. For the Indian Office, the survival of their assimilationist program at times trumped the survival of actual Indian people. Racism also impacted Indigenous access to healthcare during the pandemic. The early 20th century was a low point in American race relations. Jim Crow laws racially segregated the South, the extrajudicial lynching of non-whites for imagined crimes was at an all-time high, and eugenic thinking dominated much of the medical literature of the day. Although the Indian Wars had ended nearly 30 years before, many white Americans still clung to the axiom that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, and thus saw Native people as undeserving of care. Such thinking was particularly prevalent in the American West, where local white communities both resented and feared their supposedly savage Indigenous neighbors. They viewed Indians simultaneously as members of a dying race, naturally prone to disease, and as harbors of infection who posed a medical threat to local whites. In Greenville, California, for example, white people refused to go among the Indians during the outbreak out of fear of catching influenza from them. During the height of the epidemic in Arizona, a white physician traveled to the San Carlos agency to tend to the agency's white employees. When the superintendent pleaded with him to help Indian patients as well, he replied that he would not visit the sick Indians in their teepees for $10,000. Some of the most harmful cases of racism came from agency employees themselves. Although it would seem logical to assume that people who entered the Indian service had at least some sympathy for Native people, the reality was that many viewed their employment not as a calling, but simply as a steady and secure, if underpaid, government job. They brought with them all of the assumptions and prejudices of the larger society. At the Tolina boarding school in New Mexico, for example, the principal refused to acknowledge the suffering of Navajo children as they lay in their sick beds in frigid dormitories. He told them to hush up and be quiet or he would punish them, since he believed that they only groaned and complained when someone could hear them. His wife, the matron of the school, displayed a similarly callous attitude. Unwilling to inconvenience herself by tending to the children overnight, she left several of them to die alone in their beds, or perhaps even worse, in beds they shared with other ill children. Unconvinced that the children who survived their initial attack needed rest, she also forced many of them into the school gardens to dig vegetables before they had fully recovered. She claimed that these children were only pretending to be sick. As a result, several relapsed. In the end, 10 out of 81 Navajo children at the school died from influenza. Rather than feel any guilt about the part she played in this outcome, the matron told a fellow employee that the children better not fall ill again, for if they did, they would, quote, have to die, as she would not touch them again when they were sick because they were too filthy for her to touch when they were sick. These examples of explicit racism are shocking, but more often than not, it was implicit rather than explicit bias that prevented Indigenous people from getting the care that they needed. Imbued with the nationalistic ardor of the Great War, many physicians believed it was their patriotic duty to help their fellow citizens in distress. This feeling, however, did not extend to Indians who were considered others and not fully part of the American body politic. Despite the fact that nearly 10,000 Indians served in the First World War, white doctors chose to care for white citizens first during the pandemic. As Special Agent L.A. Dorrington reported from the Reno agency in Nevada, naturally, the white people received the first attention and the Indians were more or less neglected. Indian service physicians were not immune to this thinking. Many tried to leave their posts to join the US Public Health Service during the pandemic, since they believed they could do more good serving white patients. A doctor stationed at the Sells Indian School in Arizona, for example, telegraphed the Indian office in mid-October 1918 to ask for a 4-month furlough to assist in civilian health work during this serious national health emergency. Apparently, Indigenous civilians didn't count. These requests became such a problem that the Indian office had to explicitly prohibit furloughs and resignations of its personnel during the pandemic. Nevertheless, local governments sometimes commandeered Indian service medical workers anyway. In late October 1918, for example, the Indian office planned to transfer one of its physicians from Gettysburg, South Dakota, to Greenville, California, where local Maidu Indians were desperate for medical attention. At the last minute, the Potter County Council of Defense of South Dakota requested that the doctor remain where he was to assist in relief work among white citizens. Wishing to preserve a good relationship with the local authorities in Gettysburg, the Indian office acquiesced. Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Cato Sells, promised the superintendent at Greenville that the doctor would come later, but he acknowledged that it would probably be too late for him to render any assistance to the influenza-stricken Maidu. From the perspective of white officials, white lives mattered more than Indian ones. Native people also often found themselves denied care because of their muddled legal status in early 20th century America. The 14th Amendment had not automatically granted them US citizenship, and federal allotment policy had promised citizenship only to those who proved themselves competent to handle their own financial affairs. Thus, while some Indians had become American citizens by the time of the pandemic, most remained government wards. To add to the confusion, some tribes were recognized by the federal government, while other Indians belonged to unrecognized communities that lacked a federal relationship. The Indian Office held that it only owed medical aid to members of recognized tribes who remained federal wards. Citizen Indians, whether from recognized or unrecognized tribes, were on their own. In theory, if these citizen Indians could not afford their own medical aid, they were entitled to the same help from states and counties as other indigent Americans. In reality, racial prejudice and confusion over their legal status meant that many Native people were left without care of any kind during the pandemic. Native people living in the segregated South found it particularly hard to get medical care. Most belonged to unrecognized tribes and thus did not qualify for federal aid. Their racial status as Indian, meanwhile, made it difficult for them to access services in biracially segregated facilities. In an oral history, Lumbee Indian Crossie Lowry recalled her struggle to find a physician during the pandemic in Richmond, Virginia. Heavily pregnant and sick with the flu, she pleaded with 3 different doctors before she found one that would come and tend to her. Ultimately, her baby died within a few hours of birth. Such hardship, however, was not limited to the South. Local authorities in California frequently refused to acknowledge the citizenship status of Indians living in their state, and thus denied such individuals care in county institutions. Pomo Indian Robert Parrish, for example, complained to the Secretary of the Interior that officials in Manchester, California, refused to help his people during the outbreak because they considered them to be federal wards. Can it be possible that Indians are that low, he lamented, that they are not considered as a person or human? Following such protests, federal officials pressured local governments in California to take responsibility for indigent citizen Indians, but not before many had already suffered and died. As the preceding examples illustrate, even when systems are in place to provide for the medical needs of marginalized communities, a variety of factors, including poverty, isolation, cultural prejudice, racial bias, and discrimination based on citizenship status, can result in substandard care. And I'd like to say that we've learned from the lessons of the past, and the 100 years after the influenza pandemic, we're much better equipped to recognize and address the factors that result in poor health outcomes for these communities. But unfortunately, this has not proved to be the case. Modern medicine has made tremendous strides forward over the past century, but certain groups still cannot access all of these benefits. Ongoing disparities in health become even starker in the face of novel diseases that are not easily prevented or treated. During the H1N1 swine flu pandemic in 2009, for example, American Indians and Alaska Natives still died at a rate 4 times higher than that of other ethnic groups, strikingly similar to the 1918 pandemic. Scholarly studies of the H1N1 outbreak revealed that this excess mortality was not due to any kind of racial or genetic factor, but rather stems from the fact that Native people on average continue to suffer from a higher prevalence of chronic health conditions that result from their poor living conditions, as well as delayed access to medical care. Unfortunately, our current crisis with COVID-19 has further demonstrated how little progress we've made over the last century to improve health outcomes for the country's Indigenous people, who remain impoverished, overlooked, and marginalized. Despite the modern economic successes and casino wealth of a few select tribes, Indians as a whole remain the poorest population in the United States today, which comes as a legacy of the economic devastation wrought in the late 19th and early 20th centuries through federal policies like allotment. Today, around 1 in 4 Native Americans live below the poverty line. Indians living on reservations have incomes that are less than half of those of the general US population. And poverty, of course, means poor living conditions. Some reservations, like the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, for example, face severe housing crises. As a result, large multi-generation families crowd together under the same roof, which makes effective social distancing nearly impossible. Other reservations, like the Navajo Reservation in the Four Corners region of the American Southwest, lack the infrastructure to provide all tribal citizens with running water. And it's hard to regularly clean and disinfect your home when you have to haul water from miles away. Meanwhile, although technically the federal government today supports tribal self-determination rather than assimilation and recognizes its continued obligation to tribes, federal services for Indian people remain woefully underfunded. The Indian Health Service, which now exists as a division within the US Department of Health and Human Services, for example, has a fixed budget each year to care for more than 2.2 million Native people, no matter how much care they might need. That budget, which in 2013 averaged around $2,849 per person, is far below the average spent per person in healthcare across the nation as a whole, which is around $7,717. Indian Health Service facilities are frequently under-equipped and understaffed. In addition, Native people may live hours away by car from the nearest Indian Health Service facility, making it difficult, if not impossible, for them to receive consistent care. As a result of the multiple burdens of poverty, poor living conditions, inadequate medical care, and difficulty accessing care, Indian people today suffer disproportionately from chronic health problems like diabetes, asthma, heart disease, liver and kidney disorders, and autoimmune diseases. These pre-existing conditions of poor health have left Native people especially vulnerable to the effects of COVID-19. As was true with the influenza pandemic of 1918, the rural isolation of many Native people today has not protected them from COVID-19. The new disease has already infiltrated Indian communities across the country. As of this past Monday, April 20th, the Indian Health Service had confirmed at least 1,601 cases and 59 deaths. The Navajo Nation in the Southwest has been particularly hard hit. By the end of March, they had already recorded 148 confirmed cases and 5 deaths, which prompted New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham to warn President Trump that such incredible spikes of coronavirus could potentially wipe out some tribal communities. In the weeks since, those numbers have only grown. As of April 14th, the Navajo Nation reported 813 confirmed cases, which is a higher per capita infection rate than almost every US state. Other tribal communities like the Zia Pueblo and the San Felipe Pueblo have also recorded very high infection rates, 3.4% for the Zia and 2.36% for San Felipe. To put that into perspective, New York City's infection rate is currently around 2.33%. Unfortunately, as was true in the past, the government has been slow to respond to the mounting crisis in Indian country. Reportedly, as Congress debated the recent COVID-19 stimulus package, for example, both the White House and various Republican senators balked at including any funds for tribes at all. Ultimately, after some political wrangling, Congress appropriated $8 billion for tribes to stem job losses and economic instability caused by the coronavirus pandemic. This is less than half of what tribes had requested. Another $2 billion will go to the Indian Health Service and to tribal healthcare clinics as emergency supplemental funding. Unfortunately, only citizens of recognized tribes will be able to access these funds. As was true in 1918, unrecognized Indigenous communities, like the Chinook Indian Nation in Washington State and the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina, remain ineligible for federal services designated for Indians. As eligible tribal governments wait for the distribution of life-saving federal funds, some tribes have begun taking proactive measures to help their own communities. The Lumbee Nation in the Pacific Northwest, for example, introduced prevention measures like social distancing, drive-through testing, and telemedicine clinics in early March, well before many state and local governments made similar preparations. The tribe also repurposed a community fitness center into a field hospital to treat coronavirus patients. Similarly, the Navajo Nation has issued stay-at-home orders and police-enforced curfews to stem the spread of COVID-19 among its citizens. Tribal healing rituals like the jingle dress dance, meanwhile, have gone viral over social media in recent weeks to provide comfort and solidarity across Indian country. Now it remains to be seen just how deeply Indian country will be affected by COVID-19. Let's hope that if we didn't learn lessons from the influenza pandemic of 1918, that we do learn from our experiences this time around and that we can do better in the future. And thank you very much. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mikaela. We've got questions coming in. So the first one is from our dear friend, Melinda Maynor-Lowry, who is joining us from Durham. And Melinda wanted to know if you could comment on any relationship that you saw between federal policies concerning Native people and immigrant communities, either in 1918, 1919, or even today. And she's thinking in particular about Latinx communities, many of whom are also Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, no, that's something that I thought about, not very fully and completely, but certainly I think there's interesting comparisons to be drawn, especially when we think about the role that citizenship status plays and access to medical care. And so that's something very interesting that I found for the pandemic in 1918 is that Indian peoples are in this weird loophole where some of them are considered federal wards, some are considered to be citizens, but if you're a citizen, you're not entitled to services from the Indian office. But then again, local governments can still consider them wards, so they're also not willing to provide services and they're not willing to see them as citizens. And so that obviously there's some interesting parallels between that situation and what's happening today with undocumented people today who cannot access the kinds of health services that American citizens can access. And as Melinda rightly points out, many undocumented people in the United States are of Indigenous origin. So we do see these questions about who is considered to be a legitimate member of a polity really shaping access to healthcare. And so I think certainly there are interesting parallels to draw there. As for Native American peoples in the United States, all Native peoples received citizenship in 1924 with the Indian Citizenship Act. So that sort of weird status of ward citizen was sort of partially resolved through the Citizenship Act, although there's still weird questions about what does it mean to still be a federal ward when you're also a full US citizen. So that those issues kind of remain to the present.
Thank you. All right. Julie Reed, another fan favorite, is sending us a question from State College, Pennsylvania. So Julie would like to know if you can comment on, or Julie asks, we know that boarding schools bear some responsibility for Indigenous language loss, but what connection or commentary have you seen, if any, in the documentary record about the loss of speakers, Indigenous language speakers to influenza, and aware, of course, that one of things that's trending on social media from Indian communities today is an awareness that particularly language speaking elders are especially vulnerable to coronavirus.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. And it is tricky because the influenza pandemic, the influenza virus in 1918, it kind of struck communities in different ways. And actually, older people were actually better off during that pandemic. There was the sort of young people in the prime of life between ages of 15 and 40 actually who were hit hardest during the pandemic, just in part because of the body's immune response. So people who could mount the strongest immune response, sort of ironically, their immune response actually killed them. So it kind of created this this sort of immune response in their lungs that sort of created a drowning effect. And so people were sort of drowning in their own fluids as a result of their body's immune response to the influenza virus. So elder people tended to be in some ways protected, but there are some exceptions. And certainly, we know there's terrible cases that come out of Alaska with Alaska Native communities, some that lost something like 80% of their populations in these villages. And the stories are horrifying. And in some of those villages, the only survivors were children. And so these children were then orphans, and they didn't have elders, they didn't have any relatives really to care for them. So some missionaries and the government kind of set up orphanages for them. And clearly that would have led to a lot of sort of loss of cultural knowledge and language loss as these children have been being raised by outsiders. And I've come across some references to orphans from other Native communities as well, who end up oftentimes getting placed in boarding schools as sort of, this is going to be where they'll receive care and grow up. And so obviously those children are completely cut off from culture and community as well, unless they happen to have other children from their same community in the boarding school. So I haven't come across any specific references that talk about language loss, but I think those examples kind of show that this was certainly something that was going on. And there were definitely, cases of children being orphaned and finding themselves cared for by people who are not members of their own communities.
Thank you. Hannah Cohen, who is a Davidson College history major, would like to know if you can comment on Native men's and women's service in World War I, and how that may have impacted their treatment by the US government during the pandemic, but also Native people's expectations of the United States government.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's something really interesting. So Native people served in huge numbers and huge proportions during the First World War. So like I mentioned, I think the sort of official number that's given is around 10,000 Indian men served in the military. And then thousands of Indian people also served in other sort of auxiliary activities. There were huge drives for Liberty bonds on reservations, and Indian people contributed, a lot of money to these Liberty bond drives, and also they contributed a lot of money to the Red Cross. There are lots of reports of Indian women knitting and producing other objects, clothing for soldiers to send as care packages to soldiers in camps and abroad. So there was a tremendous push by the Indian Office to kind of show that Indian peoples were patriotic and they were supporting the war effort, and that the Indian Office was behind the war effort. And so certainly we see a lot of sort of Indian service in the war effort. Now, interestingly, that kind of creates these sort of pathways of infection in some ways, because there's a lot of movement of Indian peoples off of reservation to training camps across the country. And these army training camps are hotbeds of disease. And so respiratory infections are really, really common in those training camps anyway. And there's some of the first locations of influenza outbreaks. Indeed, like one of the earliest reported influenza outbreaks worldwide was at Camp Funston in Kansas. And according to my research, one of the first civilian outbreaks actually was at an Indian boarding school, the Haskell Institute in Kansas. And most likely those students were infected because of movements of military personnel from the camp to the school. There was the son of the assistant superintendent was an Army officer. He came to visit his parents the weekend right before influenza broke out at the Haskell Institute. I don't know that he was the one who carried it, but it's definitely a possibility. And there was this kind of, again, this push for Indians to be patriotic. And so boarding school officials were often inviting military recruiters and personnel to come to the boarding schools to give speeches and encourage Indians to enlist in the military. And so that, again, this creates these pathways of infection that lead Indian peoples to become more vulnerable and more exposed to influenza. In terms of how military service affects the US government's view on Indians, it certainly does. And so there's really a push for Indian citizenship that comes during the war and in the post-war years. And so the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act is kind of coming out of military service in the First World War, where Indian peoples have start arguing that we served our country, we fought for the United States, why are we not rewarded with citizenship? And so that becomes sort of part of the driving force for that Citizenship Act.
Thank you. Got a whole bunch more great questions. So Lucy Hammett would like to know if you have come across any evidence or experiences from the perspective of Indigenous people trained in Western medicine who are serving as medical doctors, perhaps in the Indian Health Service during this time period, and if you can comment on their experiences. Yeah.
No, so probably one of the most famous Indian doctor in this time period would be Charles Eastman, which a lot of us have read. He was a prolific writer as well as a Western trained physician. Grew up, in a traditional Dakota community, but then left and got a Western education starting at age 15, and then sort of spent his life in the Indian service and served as a physician back on some of the Sioux reservations in the West. His case is kind of tragic because his daughter actually dies from influenza. And so by the time of the pandemic, he had some sort of an Indian camp, I guess. It was sort of a camp that he ran in New England. And his daughter, she was I think 24 years old at the time, or in her early 20s. And she was training to be an opera singer and apparently had this beautiful voice. And tragically, she dies of influenza at the camp that her father was running. And there's and I don't know enough about his story, but there is some indication that the death of this beloved daughter contributes to the falling apart of his marriage. He was married to a white woman, and and then they sort of separate. They never divorce, but they separate in the years directly following the death. So I've been looking to try and see if he writes anything specifically about influenza, and I need to dig into that a little bit deeper. But certainly there's that sort of personal loss and personal tragedy to that story. And then in terms of Indian healthcare workers, there were definitely lots of Indians who were trained as nurses and doctors at this time, more and more nurses than doctors I've come across in the records that I've seen. There was one man named David Peake, who was a trained nurse. He ends up being transferred all over Indian country during the influenza pandemic 19, just because they were so desperate for nurses, trained nurses everywhere. So he ends up, he's in South Dakota for a while, and he gets transferred to Kansas for a while. He goes kind of all over the country, serving in different areas as the virus spreads across Indian country. And then this is interesting, there's also sort of an increased interest in getting allopathic or Western medical training on the part of Indian peoples, at least in some boarding schools. I know like the school I know best right now is the Haskell Institute in Kansas. And there are several cases of young women who were students at Haskell and who had gotten a little bit of nurse training in the school hospital and then served during the pandemic, helping out the school nurse. And in the aftermath, in the years that followed, they want to go and get professionally trained as nurses and sort of in nurse training schools. So I think it probably did encourage some Native people to become more interested and seek out Western medical training. Although there's sort of counterpoints to that, there's also reports of some Indian communities that sort of fall back more on traditional ways of knowing and healing in the wake of the pandemic. So the Indian office kind of likes to tell this story of, oh, everybody sees how great Western medicine is, but the reality is a little bit more complicated, where some Indian people turn back to traditional practices and others are more pragmatic and kind of adopt parts of Western healing practice and then parts of their traditional practice. It's important to keep in mind that in 1918, Western medicine was not so great either. Like they really weren't able to do anything to really mitigate influenza. They didn't know even that it was a virus at the time. They hadn't even seen viruses. The electron microscope wasn't invented until the 1930s, so they haven't even been able to identify what's causing influenza. The best treatment at the time was just sort of keeping patients warm and fed and keeping them hydrated. And you really couldn't do very much more for patients in 1918, but that kind of care was essential to survival rates. So it really was important to have nursing care, even though physicians were kind of useless during the pandemic.
Good follow-up question to that from our friend Paul Kelton in Stony Brook. And so Paul would like to know if you could comment on any evidence of discussion or debate among Western trained allopathic doctors and Indigenous peoples, especially Indigenous healers and medicine people, about germ theory.
Yeah, no, so there had been a sort of active campaign in the 10 years prior to the pandemic on the part of the Indian office to educate Indian people about germ theory and about Western medicine. And so this has been part of these sort of sanitary campaigns instituted after all these, the Indian office had been receiving all these reports of terribly high death rates on reservations, terribly high rates of tuberculosis and trachoma in particular. And so had begun to institute these sort of efforts to promote sanitation and promote healthcare. In fact, they had like an essay competition in 1912 where Indian children across the country in boarding schools were supposed to write an essay about what was tuberculosis and explaining it through the germ theory, the lens of germ theory. So there certainly had been a strong effort on the part of sort of the Indian office to promote understandings of germ theory and sort of modern medical knowledge in Indian communities. I think also though that allopathic physicians, Western physicians, were really very protective of sort of their professional status and their professional knowledge. And so they were not always willing to sort of accept Native medicine men and women as peers in any way. And they were not always willing to even extend their knowledge in ways that sort of would have combined traditional healing methods with allopathic treatment. So, it was sort of like an all or nothing. If you want to embrace Western medicine, great, but if you want to also bring in your chants and your songs and your prayers, no, we're not going to accept that. And so I came across a few newspaper articles where medicine men are like really interested in things like vaccinations and how to use syringes and needles and this kind of stuff. And doctors are like, no, we're not going to give you that knowledge because you'll just use it to be charlatans to your people. So there is sort of that sort of medical chauvinism, I guess, on the part of Western trained allopathic physicians, where yes, they're trying to get Indian people to embrace germ theory, but they're also not willing to completely share that knowledge without Native people sort of completely accepting their way of doing things. If that makes sense.
Thank you. A question from Gable Lamans, who asks, is there any evidence that insular tribes, perhaps those that were more rural or removed from larger urban areas, had different success regarding containment versus those Native nations that were more integrated into the non-Native population, perhaps located closer to major urban areas?
Yeah, this is something that I'm still sort of in the weeds with the research in some ways. So something I'm still trying to figure out. But what is sort of surprising is it seems that it doesn't matter how rural and isolated a tribe is, that they get influenza. It seems to get everywhere. It might not get there in the fall wave in 1918, but if not in the fall, then in the spring of 1919, it sweeps through. So tribes might be able to hold off influenza for a little while, but then it's just eventually it gets in. And then like I mentioned in the talk, once it does get in, being isolated is really a liability. And we definitely see that for like the Navajo Nation, which, you know, they were quite isolated in the Southwest in a very large reservation, but there were some points of contact, right? There were some trading posts, and there were some white, you know, Mormon missionaries and other white people, traders in their area, and there was agency officials. And so there were these pathways, and influenza did get in. And once it did get in, it was really devastating, because then, you know, you have people who are sick and miles away from any help, and it becomes, you know, becomes really devastating on those communities. And in fact, the Navajo Nation, they experienced an 8% fatality rate, and that's overall population. So like huge numbers of Navajo die from influenza, and they were very, very isolated. So unfortunately, influenza just does get in, and same with these villages in Alaska as well. You know, very isolated in parts of coastal and rural Alaska, and yet, you know, mail carriers and trade ships and canning companies, there are these various ways that people do get infected, despite being in very, very isolated areas. And we're seeing that now with COVID, right? I think there was sort of an assumption that like rural communities would be spared from COVID, and we're starting to see that maybe they're spared the initial onslaught, but eventually it gets in. So it's not a guarantee.
Right. And that the lack of infrastructure and also lack of media attention can itself be.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Our friend Courtney Lewis from Columbia, South Carolina, would like to know if you could comment or if you have any thoughts on the aftermath of the 1918 pandemic that Native nations can apply or be watchful for today. So perhaps any takeaways in the ways that we don't want history to repeat itself, or moments of opportunity for Native nations in the aftermath of COVID-19.
That's a great question. That's, again, one of the questions that I'm still grappling with. Does this do anything? Does it change anything? I think part of the problem in 1918 is that the pandemic coincides with the First World War. So any changes that happen in sort of the wake of the pandemic, it's also like changes that are happening in the wake of World War I and how the country is sort of dealing with the aftermath of war. There's a real sort of retrenchment in terms of federal funding in the aftermath. So in the early 1920s, the government really doesn't want to expend very much money on Indian affairs. Sort of interestingly, in 1921, there's an act passed called the Snyder Act, and it actually firmly defines medical service as one of the federal responsibilities, or one of the things Congress can appropriate money for is now medical care for Indian peoples. But the intention of the act was actually to try to like sort of put a limit or a cap on how much the government was going to spend on various Indian programming. So it was still part of this sort of ultimate goal of getting rid of federal services for Indian people, which was sort of the goal of the assimilationist period. Ironically, then it kind of provides a legal justification for all sort of future medical care for Indians, but it was intended to kind of put a limit or a restriction on what the government could spend money on. I think definitely we do see sort of a gradual greater acceptance of sort of Western medicine, but that comes as Western medicine gets better. You know, Indian people are not going to accept it when it's really, really bad in 1918, but as medicine sort of improves over the course of the 30s and 40s, and especially with the advent of penicillin, I think there is a little bit more acceptance and willingness of Native people to work with Western trained physicians. And that also comes as a result of changes to Indian policy. So with John Collier in the 1930s, and there's sort of this greater respect for Indian nations and sovereignty. And so there's more willingness to kind of develop culturally appropriate programs in the 30s and 40s. And so that also helps with that kind of sharing of knowledge. So that's, a decade after the pandemic, and a little bit, too late for people who had suffered during the pandemic. There's a push in the direct aftermath of the pandemic to move the Indian Medical Service from the Indian office to the U.S. Public Health Service. The U.S. Public Health Service doesn't really want that because they're busy dealing with veteran care. So they really don't want to add anyone else to their list of services. But eventually the Indian Medical Service is transferred to the Department of Education Health Services in 1955. And that's during the termination era. So part of the goal is to kind of, again, shed federal responsibility for Indian people, in part by moving, programs that had been in the Bureau of Indian Affairs to other departments within the government. But there are more resources then for Indian healthcare. So that is an important move. And today the Indian Health Service is located in the branch of Health and Human Services. So it's not part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs anymore. But those are some of the changes. But I'm still trying to grapple with, what does this really change in Indian country, and, what is a result of wartime changes, what is a result of policy changes, and what is a result of this pandemic.
Thank you. So something that I've been wondering, especially as I am trying to make sense of the patterns that I'm seeing on social media, is why the historical amnesia about this particular pandemic? And if you have any thoughts about why so many Americans seem to be totally unaware of this, but also the sense it seems that for many Americans, the flu is just the flu and that they downplay its severity. So if you could comment on that, but as well, you are teaching your course, right, on the history of medicine and disease right now. So as well, could you share some thoughts about perhaps what you are learning about your students' experiences, or what it's like for you as a professor teaching that class this semester during the coronavirus pandemic?
Yeah, thanks for those questions. I think first, so to the point about the flu pandemic and the way it's been forgotten, this is something that other scholars of the flu have written about quite extensively, especially Alfred Crosby. His book was called The Forgotten Pandemic, and it's because it really was sort of, at the time it was this huge event, but it did sort of get overshadowed and forgotten in historical memory until Crosby wrote about it in the 70s, really. So, and part of that, I think his argument is that it's partly because it just didn't fit in the nation's narrative itself, right? So we, everybody tells stories about who they are and what they want to be. And, America's story in the early 20th century was a story of progress and advancement and success and victory. And especially with the First World War, that was a narrative of victory. And then the flu, that didn't fit in with that narrative of victory. It wasn't something that people wanted to remember. They wanted to remember the glory of winning the war and not the defeat of suffering from this terrible pandemic. So his argument is that, people, privately people remembered because obviously they lost family members and suffered. But as a nation, people didn't want to have this be part of the story they told about themselves. And so it sort of disappeared from public memory for years and years. In terms of like this idea that, the flu isn't so bad, that's something that's been explored by another historian, Nancy Bristow, who talks about how the flu had become sort of domesticated in popular imagination by the early 20th century. It was seen as something common and commonplace and not that severe, and so people weren't afraid of it. And so when influenza struck in 1918, it came as a real shock because people were not expecting the flu to be so severe. And for a while, they weren't even sure that it was the flu. Some doctors were convinced it was a different illness or even biological warfare. There were lots of accusations that the Germans had brought this over to harm the Americans. And so, there was just a lot of struggling to make sense of something that didn't seem to make sense. And I feel like we're doing a lot of that today too. Like we've kind of assumed that modern medicine has dealt with infectious disease and we don't have to worry about infectious disease anymore. And so I think when, coronavirus hit, like we just sort of, our national narrative was not prepared for this sort of hit to our national narrative about progress and success and the victories of modern medicine, since the 1950s and 60s, especially after, penicillin. and antibiotics become more commonplace and vaccination becomes more commonplace, we've not had to deal with a lot of infectious diseases. It's just a thing of the past. We don't realize how most of humanity, for most of human history, has suffered extremely from these infectious diseases. But we've lost that memory. We've all, most of us have grown up in a world sort of free of the devastating childhood illnesses that used to, attack humanity regularly. So we've forgotten, and that just didn't enter our imaginings. And I think that's true. Like I've been teaching a disease medicine class for I guess 4 years now, and I always end the class with warning students that there's a potential that there could be another pandemic one day. But I don't think I really believed it. I can say that without really feeling it and believing it. So I feel like even this came as a shock to everyone. It came as a shock to me as well. And I think definitely there are lessons to be drawn from the past. I think we see in the past blaming of certain groups, blaming of immigrants, for example, for disease outbreaks, questions of personal liberty versus public responsibility. Those come up with people like Typhoid Mary, even, this woman who was a healthy carrier of typhoid in the early 20th century, and then ends up getting imprisoned for life because she's been infecting other people. And so that raised a lot of questions in the early 20th century about personal liberty versus public responsibility in matters of health. And so I think we're seeing a repetition of those kinds of questions with current discussions and debates about social distancing. So I think there's a lot of themes that we can look at from the past and see how they translate to the present. At the same time, as a historian, I don't know that I'm equipped to understand the present moment perfectly. I think I need a little bit more distance to fully make sense of what's going on right now.
Thank you so much for sharing your research with us tonight, Mikaela. It's been so wonderful to have you here. And as I've been trying to make sense of what's going on and hearing more about the flu being used as a reference point for how we're making sense of this moment, I was so grateful that you took some time away from your very busy teaching and parenting schedule to say yes and to come share your research with us. And when influenza in Indian country is out, I look forward to hosting you here on campus so we can do a proper in-person talk and celebrate that very important book that I'm very much looking forward to. And for everyone else, I invite you back next week for the 5th talk in the social distancing lecture series. So 7 p.m. Eastern time next Wednesday. My colleague, Devin Benson, will welcome Dr. Jennifer Lamb from Brown University. And Dr. Lamb will be talking to us about disease, politics, and power, the view from Cuba. Thank you everyone for joining us. Good night, stay healthy, and wash your hands.
Thank you. Thanks for